Welcome to the Crash Chords podcast. I am here. I am Matt.
I'm John.
I am here. I am Steve.
Did I confuse
you?
you?
Well, I thought that was the thing that you were doing.
I don't know.
You did. Man.
I did do it.
So
I actually did it.
And I was doing it then. Now I did it.
Wait. Am I here? I'm having an existential crisis.
That's
I
right.
can't. That's a hard.
He's not
oh,
in
man,
on this.
I don't even know why you tried to say it.
That's a word that I shouldn't be saying.
Existential stasis.
Something before I forget that's fresh off the presses of the social medias. That's actually not on my list in front of me. Two of my friends and friends to the podcast and to the website have gotten together. Nelson Lugo, as you guys know, is doing a run of Gathering the Magic. Eli August and the Abandoned Buildings are going to open some of his shows.
Hey.
Like how wait, is that like randomly just so happened, or
I'm pretty sure that Molly knows Nelson because Molly works in burlesque, and the other members of Eli August have been to burlesque shows. So I'm guessing the connection might have been there, but I'm not sure. I don't know that it was through us, but it's cool to see them hook up and connect. And
that's pretty cool. Yeah.
Eli's going to be opening a few shows for them. I'm not sure how much of the rest of the band will be there too because they come from all over.
We're like the nexus of a thing.
Maybe could be.
Anyway.
In other news of guests to the show, Circadian Clock, who is on here in episode...
at 121.
They're finally playing at the Way Station. We talked about this when they were guests. They're playing January 22nd. It's a Thursday, a week later from the Wasties show I mentioned last week. They will be playing at 9 o'clock. Please go check them out. We will likely be there in some capacity. And their live show, I hear, is incredible. I've not actually seen them live yet, but I'm looking forward to checking them out at the Way Station.
Some capacity, not every capacity. I don't know. Maybe we'll be invisible. Who knows? That's a capacity, not a full capacity. But a
Moving
capacity.
on, some upcoming autographs guests that were just confirmed. I've already recorded, as of this show, my interview with Sulfur, the other half of the Thought Criminals, who teams up with Michael Kill and a solo nerdcore rapper in his own right. We chatted about his new Ninja Turtles EP, his Thor EP that he did the year before, and his new original rap nerdcore record that he's putting out later this year. Also, Adam Warrock, much talked about by me on the podcast. He's finally coming on the show, and we will talk a little bit more about him in a minute. Shy Boy, who is the lead singer of a band called Hypnogaja, who's one of the first interviews I'd ever done for the show in type. He's got a very successful solo career now, in a similar vein of what he was doing with Hypnogaja. He's coming on as well. He just put out a brand new record called Lost in Space, and we're going to talk about that, as well as his record Waters on Mars, which came out last year. Actually, they both might have come out last year.
Sensing a space theme, perhaps?
Yes, he actually has a lot of spacey-related stuff. And then the final guest that's confirmed for autographs to come out later this year is Beefy, another nerdcore rapper. He's been guested on albums of other artists that I've spoken to: Michael Kill, Adam Warrock, Schaefer the Dark Lord, Dr. Awkward. He's a fantastic nerdcore rapper in his own right. He put out a brand new record called Grown Up last year in 2014. We'll chat about that as well as what he's working on now. So that's exciting. Those four artists are going to be on the show soon, so keep an ear out for that.
Back to the Hypnogazer one. You did that back in 2010, correct?
Correct, yes. And it was actually featured on their website for a while, on the Hypnogazer site. I've been friends with Shy Boy and his keyboardist Mark for a long time, Mark Dolkin. And so I'm grateful to get Shy Boy on the podcast, the new podcast. It's actually really exciting. They've been big musicians out in LA for a long time. They come to New York every so often, though I've not been able to see them in person since they've been to New York. Going back to Adam Warrock, who I mentioned, he's coming on autographs also to promote his new EP that's coming out the end of this month. His new EP is called Gifted Student. I believe it's to be a more personal record, although he does do personal songs. I think this whole record is supposed to be from a more personal perspective, and it's actually being produced by the one and only Michael Kill, who we mentioned earlier, who, if you listen to that episode, he has a huge...
You got a harem going here? Everybody's related.
He's got a huge foothold in production. He's a great nerdcore rapper, but his true love is production, and he talks about how he's more musically influenced by major rap producers like Dr. Dre and others that he had mentioned. And so I'm excited for this new EP to come out that's produced by him, but, it's still the music of another nerdcore rapper who I enjoy as well. It'll be a cool collaboration.
You should just go out there and say, hey, you know what? I'll produce. I set you guys up. I got the connections.
They
no problem.
They knew each other before.
Well, in that case, but I'm just assuming now, as a result of all these, that you somehow are the curator of these connections.
No, actually, I'm very grateful that because they all know each other, they've kind of curated a relationship with me through the internet.
Ah, look at that.
Because Michael Kill, Tribe One, Adam Warrock, Schaefer the Dark Lord, Beefy, all of these artists, Dr. Awkward, have worked together and have toured together in some capacity or another. Jesse Dangerously, who I haven't had on yet, Sulfur. They've all worked together in some capacity, so there's a strong link between all of them. They actually have a great collaborative go-through, which is kind of cool.
I would love to see that tree diagram. What's that kind of
diagram? A tree.
Well, like the 7 degrees of Kevin Bacon hiding a diagram between all of them.
True. Like a family tree, like a genealogical tree.
Yeah, genealogical.
Yeah,
that's it. That's the word.
With
genealogical.
Who. Right.
Hey, I said that right.
Yeah.
There we go.
Kind of.
All right.
Close enough.
Maybe. Kind of a web.
That's actually probably a lot more accurate.
Okay.
Why don't we get on with this episode and our album of this week?
All right. Well, for anyone that knows, the band Yo La Tengo, Extra Painful, which I mentioned in last week's promo, might remind you of the album Painful, an album that they released way back in 1993. And it very well should, because Extra Painful is a near verbatim reissue of that album, with the addition of several bonus tracks, several demos, and unreleased work. Now, the main reason they reissued this album is because of the band's 30th year anniversary, and even though the album itself is only 22 years old, it goes back to 93, it was actually their 6th release, so they were already veterans by the point of releasing it, they decided to go with this album, with Painful. So why choose this album for re-release? It's it's generally regarded as their culminating work, partially because it pushed the subgenre shoegaze into the mainstream. It was already a thing by like the mid 80s, maybe late 80s, but certainly by 93, I think Yo La Tengo could be credited as bringing it to fruition. Few other reasons. Even according to Pitchfork magazine here, this was the first album made with longtime producer Roger Moutonneau, and the first album to be issued through Matador Records, whose post-pavement popularity and resultant Atlantic Records partnership afforded the band their widest distribution yet. So, it's an important time. Actually, in addition to that, it was the second album to feature their bassist James McNew, and it was the first to fully enmesh his sensibilities with Kaplan and Hubley's, shirking the typical new guy third-wheel dynamic for a more polyamorous professional relationship that continues to this day. Gotta love Pitchfork magazine.
See,
anyway,
words are hard.
Well, the font in this case was also harder. But we're not doing Extra Painful. It's about high time we mention that. Mainly because when I noticed that Yo La Tengo was releasing a new album, I made the mistake of glancing at that and was like, ooh, new work from Yo La Tengo. Didn't realize it was reissue at that point. Then when I consider the fact that this reissue is sort of an attempt to impart to their listeners how the album was made in the first place through all these demos and unreleased work, it seemed to be an interesting concept, but it wasn't quite... It's not the way you go about analyzing an album front to back. It's disparate work. It's not all made at the same time. It's more of fan service in that particular case. So I thought that would be an interesting opportunity to go back to the original itself, Painful, released in 93. So this is one of those rare occasions where we get to actually go against our rule of thumb, which otherwise would keep us grounded in modern albums for the purposes of having stable, even-tempered reviews, especially when your selection is from other contemporary albums. But we've been known to dip into the past at times, usually at the behests of our guests, and it seemed like for a reissue like this, it would be the perfect occasion.
It's also the fact that the band, being now in their 30th year, is putting forth this as the idea of them, as idea of their greatest work. So they're even putting it out there as this will still stand against.
Their culminating work. Culminating
work.
to say that.
Good way to put it. They're actually making the claim that here, this album, Painful, does stand up against today's music. That's why they're willing to reissue it. Maybe with the extra demo tracks and everything like that, you're getting a little bit of fan service, but the very fact that they're willing to put forth an album that is 20 years old as, here, do it again, listen to it again, enjoy it again, it's worth putting back into the pantheon of music. Mm-hmm. That's a pretty bold claim.
Exactly. That's why I figured it would be an interesting thing to investigate. Not just to, of course, see how, it's influenced modern music, but to see whether it would just still hold up, whether people... why people actually liked it to begin with, all of those questions. And it was an incredibly popular album for its time. It's helpful every once in a while to challenge the work of a previous time and pretend that it's new, since we are new to this particular album ourselves. One more note about shoegaze. I put it out there as the general genre of this album. I think I've only mentioned shoegaze in one other occasion, and that would be way back in episode 43 when we reviewed Lowe's The Invisible Way. And even though that album itself was far from shoegaze, because that was a modern album and they were kind of removed from shoegaze at that point, at least for that album, which seemed to drift more toward folk, they were pretty entrenched in shoegaze as of the early mid-90s. In many ways, they were contemporaries of this exact album. That was probably when they got their start. And I should probably just describe a little bit what it is. It was actually coined by Melody Maker. That's a British music press magazine, and they coined it because the musicians in these bands stood still during live performances in a detached, introspective, non-confrontational state, hence the idea that they were gazing at their shoes. It's an interesting little description of to describe what we've often searched to describe as the introspective band or the introspective type of work. This kind of captures that quite beautifully. And musical elements you would find would be the use of effects pedals to quite a heavy degree, which kind of contributed to the image of them looking down at their feet at concerts, because they have to look at their feet in order to see where the damn pedals are. So perhaps it was all just a lark to begin with. Other things, of course, are those long, drawn-out guitar sounds that are used just as, ambient work in the background. I've often commented on that being an element in post-rock, which certainly borrowed from shoegaze. So, that leads to them generally being described, to the layman, as dreamlike. This is why people go to Yo La Tengo in the first place. And my personal experience with Yo La Tengo goes back to college, when I actually got to fill out that good old cliched college atmosphere of just putting on a black light and sitting around talking about life while this stuff was going on. Not this album per se, but disparate tracks from Yo La Tengo, which I couldn't name because they were all over the place. It was introduced to me by my roommate. So, from there, we go into this particular album and see what brought them to the limelight and why I could actually enjoy them in such a way. So, we begin with the track Big Day Coming, a track which is actually repeated later on the album in an oddball second version, quite different. But let's start with the first.
So, as a start to the record, it starts kind of serene and mellow.
It has a very familiar...
all those things.
Well, no, it has a very familiar build in it. It's not bending any rules, let alone breaking any rules. It seems to be following a very natural chordal progression towards what goes from the intro into the actual main verse melody.
I think it barely even call it a chordal progression. It's in A-flat major, and it generally stays in A-flat major, following on a single motif, simply... counting in major tones here, 1 3 1 4 3 3 1, over and over and over and over again throughout the entire track. That's basically what you're dealing with.
The whole track.
Almost the whole entire track. It comes across as being very soothing, but also a little bit nulling. This is where you kind of have to play the game and see, well, what would a 1993 audience think of this? What do we think of this? Well, I don't know. I'd still imagine a good variety of people would say soothing, also kind of nulling. After a while, you start to forget certain things, you start to focus on certain things more than you otherwise might. That's why I should probably bring in the voice, because the voice is kind of a background thing here, especially when you consider that motif, which is so repetitive by this point. But the voice is distant, it's childish, a little bit meek, kind of defeated, and maybe hopeful all at once. And yet it's not a prominent instrument. Usually when we encounter cases like this, the voice itself we would cite it as not being prominent, therefore it is used as an instrument. But I don't think that's really the case here. It doesn't seem to be used as an instrument. It's just there, kind of drifting in the sea of everything else.
It makes it very difficult to understand what he's saying, which I believe could be a good focal point for this track. The problem is they're not, like you said, they're not using it as an instrument, so how he's saying it is not very important in this case. But because it's so difficult to hear what he's saying is not very important in this case.
Yeah, and that's
so it's that questionable, where is this singer coming from? What is his role in this situation here? That was one of the big detractors for this and a lot of other songs coming along. Otherwise, there was a good soundscape going on here. There was a good use of the dissident guitars to build something. But with the lack of culmination in anything, it feels like so many elements are just not peaking, are just falling flat. Now, I know that
it's like they're building something and stacking stones around a building that you can't even see an image of yet. You can't even imagine what it's gonna look like.
The whole thing is, it's not just building stones. It's moving one stone pile to another area and then taking that pile and moving it back. I don't feel like there's any actual progression going on here.
Yet there may very well be a reason for that, albeit one of those sort of high-minded artistic reasons, but the idea of like a big day coming about a mile away. This is the chorus that returns. If not that you can really discern the spot where the chorus comes in, especially considering that the motif is so prevalent. But you can kind of hear through. It comes back again. There is a big day coming about a mile away. There's a big day coming. I can hardly wait. It's like this hopefulness that lurks in the background, but it never quite takes shape. The big day has never arrived. It's always coming. It's always, you're looking forward to it, but it's never there. In the meantime, you're just sort of going through the motions, going through life, and you do get the sense that he's caught up in the middle of something bigger, but he's caught up in his own head. Almost like it's a consistent delusion.
And there's no excitement associated with this. I don't expect excitement.
No.
Not with what they were building here, but hope might even be too strong of a word. It's just it comes across as knowledge, as oh yeah, there's a big day coming. Not I should be hopeful about it. No, it's just matter of factly something's going to happen eventually.
Yeah, we get a little bit of that in the verse. Let's wake up the neighbors, let's turn up our amps, and we know we're used to, without having a plan, we can play a Stone song sitting on the fence, and it'll sound pretty good till I forget how it ends. It's all just very much, a day. It's like their version of a day in the life.
It's very matter of fact. And I mean, that's also
a day in the life with hope.
That's the problem, I think, with this song also, is that because it kind of just goes through the motions, it becomes notably repetitive. Not so repetitive that you're pained by it. We've listened to far worse repetitive songs, but it's definitely noticeable, especially towards the end. The song is on the longer side. It's a 7-minute track.
Yeah, I think it was probably the biggest drawback.
And me and Steve were talking about how the tail end of the song, the outro, if you could call that whole chunk an outro, was fairly really repetitive. It didn't really go anywhere, do anything, build to anything.
Repetitive is not the word I would use to describe that outro. The outro was comprised of more of probably the most variety in the entire track, because it steps in there with the long droning guitar sounds that this time start to sound very very wonky, very out of tune. They're intentionally disconnected from the rest. You're meant to walk away saying, "Ugh, that was a little unnerving.
That's right.
That was a little disgusting almost." That's where the unraveling takes place.
That's right. You were saying that the right before the outro didn't really need to exist. That 3 minutes leading up to it, because once we get to the outro,
out of 7 minutes, say maybe 4 out of 7 were the generally unchanging verses and choruses, and then the outro is the ballsy part of this track. coming from an artistic standpoint, I think it was pretty useful in unraveling this state of delusion. But just from a listener's standpoint, for a first track, you're laying a lot on the line here. It's
a lot to expect of your audience in this track. I feel to stick with it.
You need to remember usage.
I don't think it's a lot to expect of your audience. That might be the wrong way to term it. It's not going to draw you people from outside your already present audience. Okay. I think that might be a better way, because if somebody is familiar in this style of music, this is not going to be breaking any grounds here. But for somebody who may be a little more oriented towards higher energy pieces or something like that, they might say the word droning over and over again. They might say, it never really goes anywhere. It never really repeats. But there are little aspects of it that are still quite smart, quite ingenious.
Well, since you were commenting on the end, though, that's what I meant by you have to consider usage, what people might use this music for. And I think that at least for those first 4 minutes, while it was consistent, people might use it as ambient background music, much like what I said earlier about just like laying back and zoning out to a blacklight, man. Yeah, it's great. You could talk about life and all that stuff. You could probably even start to zone out that consistent motif. But once you reach the end portion where it starts getting really wonky, I think this is going to spoil your mood a little bit. Intentionally so, but all of a sudden that usage is no longer applicable.
Yeah, that's exactly it. You don't really... There's so much going on, without too much going on, in the actual song. No, it's the wall of sound that they're creating with the soundscape, ambient orientation that they were doing. When you start just pulling out little strings here and there at the end, it does get very interesting. But you're right, it really does destroy the mood, the emotion that they were building in the first part of the song.
Yeah, and that's kind of a take it or leave it sort of thing, depending upon what you're going toward, what you were looking for.
I wasn't against it. I really wasn't against it.
I was interested.
Me neither.
But, well, where do you go from there? And from a Motel 6... I mean, you're getting a big emotional change just going into the next track.
Yeah, and that's well, we'll talk about it.
The track 2 definitely moves. It's more fast-paced than the first track. Feels kind of more indie rock in a sense.
Indie rock, of course, you have to consider the time frame here, 1993. I'm thinking like a early predecessor to indie rock, which is grunge, and the thing that was like out at the time and born of a more heavy sound was grunge, and I feel like this is kind of drifting back here. It's hard to say, I would throw this entire band into shoegaze just to make it simple, but of course, it's kind of born from similar sounds as of the 80s that also yielded the grunge sound. So again, usage. It depends on what your propensity is as a musician. Do you want to use that sort of muddy bass sound to get really, really heavy and a little bit more intense, or do you want to kind of shrink back into yourself? There lies the split between grunge and shoegaze, but it seems like they're hopping over the river right here.
Well, with this song, though, they're doing something that, I mean, even for 1993, just didn't feel very unique. It was this song is pretty straightforward, fairly predictable. It moves faster than the last track, like I said, but it gets borderline boring, and here's why. Because you've got the same guitar riff, you've got a drum that's kind of erratic. It's not even, like, interesting erratic, it's just kind of all over the place. And it, like I said, it's just very straightforward. It just kind of goes. It doesn't really go anywhere, it just goes.
There was one thing that I liked at first, and that was the way they were using that guitar with a sort of a siren kind of an idea, bring in, and then trail it off. That was great.
It's actually
first.
Well, this is another one of those riffs that repeats over and over. That begins, that starts off the track, and that's the riff that sets you off, and then you kind of retreats back for the duration of the verse, and then it comes back in the interludes between each verse. It's essentially it's a whiny, sort of scraggly guitar that falls chromatically from the home key, which is G here, and it does that over and over again. It's an interesting concept. It also kind of perpetuates that unraveling nature, but this time it's more disconnected from the group. The rest of the track doesn't really embody that. This is more of a general pop song from that framework from that kind of grungy, but more uplifting pop framework. It only serves a purpose just in that interlude is my problem. It doesn't really come back at any point. I don't see any other instances of unraveling, except perhaps following the bridge where the guitar kind of returns to this like white noise static. You get it there, and it seems to be a running theme as of the album for 2 tracks here, but it does set up like an overall sound here. If you can accept the fusion of those 2 or possibly 3 different styles, say the accessible, approachable pop song, combined with a little bit more of a muddy sound, a little bit more dissonant, and then combine that with the light-hearted, not light-hearted, but light and delicate, introverted shoegaze sound. This is like all 3 rolled into one, and I suppose for 1993, well, that is pretty important. I don't think I could cite that anywhere in the 80s, for instance.
But using that guitar during the interludes ended up being a distraction for me. I just couldn't really focus on anything but it when it was around, and it wasn't... Like I said, it started off kind of impressive, but it definitely wore on me fairly quickly. By the 5th repetition, which happens before, I believe, the first verse, it was... I wanted them to move on. I wanted them to start experimenting. Keeping it at the same levels, and that's something that is a theme here. The levels are so close to one another, you really don't get a sense of forefront and background as far as the instruments are going. Either something is in it, and it seems to be layered into the same area, or it's just not present at that point. I don't feel like anybody's taking a role here, especially not the vocalist.
Yeah.
Well, also with the vocals in this track, it's much like the last track. We're not really getting anything understandable unless you focus and read the lyrics. You're not getting a sense. Like reading the lyrics now in front of holding them in front of myself, I didn't get a sense of any of them listening to the songs. And I listened to this album several times, like the chorus. I climb where I can see. You're close, but I won't reach. Blank stare at the TV. CNN's on Channel 3.
I can't live with that day in the life kind of stuff.
It's just,
in fact, leaving the next verse almost reminds me is like, well, unless I'm misinterpreting it, but it almost kind of reminds me of well, it brings me back to 1993 in a particular way. In the passing line on 1 and 9, and I'm thinking perhaps that's a reference to the subway back when the 1 and the 9 actually used to run, and the 9 has been gone for upwards of a decade now. It's the 1.
I think it's actually the 1 and 9 highway in New Jersey.
All right.
Well, because it says the next line, it says stuck Jersey. In a sad car, stuck in a drive.
Okay. A little topical. We're in New York, and the 1 and 9 is a fairly important Jersey throughway for us to get around, near the city.
But the point though is that Steve's right. It's again very day in the life lyrics, and let me say up front, day in the life lyrics. There's nothing wrong with that. But usually there's some connection point. If someone's singing about a day in their life, usually they're singing a very personal song where you're connecting to their emotional state or how they feel or what they're going through. Talking about their hardships in their daily life, talking about a bad neighborhood or bad parents or whatever.
Or to go in the opposite direction, which seems to be what they're going for, they're taking it as trying to explain the mundane in a more fantastical way. Because A Day in the Life, the Beatles song, it's done in such a way that dreamlike mundaneness becomes fantastical.
But this is not even going fantastical.
This is like a bridge between the two.
It's just average. It's just, here's stuff. It's like...
Then it epitomizes the average track. What are you going to experience from a Motel 6? Motel 6s, I don't think, are often very high points in your life.
Fair.
So, when you're looking at things like this, even just the final line here, I drift off to sleep while the snow falls on the screen. Wow, you can't get any more... That's pretty existential right there, just falling asleep with the static. It's funny, because when I was little, probably around, when I was little, would have been about when this was released, 93, and I used to call it snow.
Everyone did.
Everyone did. Okay.
It was called that when I was growing up, too.
It's not just you.
Okay.
It's not just something from your generation.
I feel validated
we had
by
that too.
Well, yeah.
Back in the day when I was young.
That's
right.
They
don't have it anymore, so it's...
You probably had cable earlier than I did, though, because we were pretty late to get cable. So broadcasting snow was big for us.
Anyway.
So I was pretty old. Yeah, that's kind of a tangent. There's a thing about there's a thing about this that I think we haven't mentioned that's also another usage, and that is concert approachability. Because this is such an uplifting track, I have to think like, well, that post-punk audience for the early 90s that wants something a little bit more relatable at the same time, not thrashy like you might get from punk. I think that's what this track is generally embodying. And you know what? I don't know. Concerts fluctuate. You're going to get things from earlier in the album. You're going to get stuff from here. But this is probably not the one where you're really going to be paying attention to the lyrics. You're probably just going to be swaying back and forth a little bit. And I think this track is suitable for that. I can't find much more for it.
Again,
we'll see that in retrospect.
All of those words essentially are a very drawn-out way of saying it's an average track that wouldn't be terrible to listen to.
But it epitomizes average. Yeah. Huh? It's really average.
I guess we've had plenty of really average stuff, so... Moving on to track 3, Double Dare.
Really very medium.
Which, Double Dare could be a reference to the TV show of the same name, which was also on in the 90s, though I doubt it. I haven't read the lyrics, so I could be wrong. Again, we're not really getting anything fantastical.
Well, now we're just superimposing our 90s references, but that's not a way to go about this. I'm gonna stretch this to say that there's more emphasis on the white noise here than in the last track for sure. In addition to that, you get in the interludes more of an emphasis on these little 7 chords here and there, which kind of combine with the distortion and the white noise, and it pushes it through. That's another time to bring back in the vocals here. The vocals feel like they're kind of straining to be heard through the distortion at times. Sometimes, like in previous cases, it feels like it's just sort of laid on top gently as another layer, speaking over everything, kind of musing to yourself. But this time, it seems a little bit more imminent, like you're trying to cut through the crap. I mean, perhaps this is a long way to go for this, but I don't think so when you consider some of these lyrics. I feel the need to repeat, I should know, like a stutter. Yeah. You shouldn't have to tell me. Sometimes it's the way we feel, or the way we feel, interesting. We feel pretty bad. In a double dare, he's got wandering eyes, and I see him look at you, looking straight at you, but I know where they are. I'll walk you home, you take as long as it takes. The sun in the morning sky, we'll know where we are, we'll know where we are. It's kind of a need to prove something a little bit here. But also, I don't know, this is probably one of the cagier lyrics on this album. At the same time, just going off with that first stanza, sometimes it's the way we feel, or the way we feel pretty bad. That he doesn't seem to know where he is.
No.
He doesn't seem to know entirely. This is a stream of consciousness, in a sense.
It could be. I mean, also this song is where we're really getting a sense of them being kind of one riff wonders. And with the guitar, they tend to kind of just... I mean, not all the guitar work. Let me not get ahead of myself. But I get a sense of it in this track, at least, that it's not really doing anything... Again, I feel it's very predictable, like the last track was.
Well, there was... And I've kept my piece till now. This is the first time I'm actually focusing on something in the song. And that was the pickup, the little bit of extra... I don't know, energy going on here. It feels like there's something coming through in this guy's mind. The duality of the two guitars going back and forth was actually really good. I like the dissonance that they were building on top of one another. And then it goes into that solo, I guess, would be the right word, though it's more expose than anything else. It doesn't really have the iconic solo, and frankly, I don't think a true, like,
I don't think these guys do iconic solos. I don't think I would have wanted it.
You wouldn't have something like that. But here, that expose kind of flatlines, and it just says, well, everything that we were doing with the guitars, we're just going to keep doing it. It's not fully repetitive, but it doesn't do anything.
It's not fully fleshed out.
Yeah, it's not going anywhere, and it just comes off as sloppy more than anything else for me.
I'll give you that. I mean, first of all, I am getting a distinct sense of arc here. To what end, I don't know yet, but at least when you look at the fact that we've gone from a fairly mellow, almost quintessentially shoegaze track in the beginning, onto track 2 where it's a little heavier, light distortion, but frankly that doesn't take away from the fact that it's a pop track. And then here we're kind of laying on that distortion quite a bit heavier. It pushes it into garage territory almost, kind of the way I cited on Daryl's Ohio back in episode 114. That was kind of garagey. We were citing that all over the place, and yet at that time that was a 2004 album. That's a decade after this, decade before us. But it feels like, again, it's cut from the same cloth. It's kind of borrowing in that very local territory vibe, but seeing if they can push that art form a little further. Yet, at the same time, I gotta say, I think Daryl's Ohio was doing a little bit better at this point in the album. It had its own meandering qualities, but
I feel it's kind of apples and oranges too.
Perhaps, but when you look at the mixing and the quality of the instruments, there's similarities here, distinct similarities. It's just, I don't know. This strikes me as being a little bit simpler. Nevertheless, I think things are getting muddied in this album. I think there's an intentional that as you push the album along, things are going to inevitably become less clear. That's true as of this point, at least.
Moving on to track 4, we have an instrumental interlude track that's kind of on the earlier side of the record. It's called Superstar-Watcher. It's completely instrumental, and this is the first time I feel like I really get a sense of what Steve has been describing as shoegaze music.
Yes.
It feels its length, first of all. It's not super long like a lot of the other tracks. It's only about a minute and a half, close to 2 minutes. But that's in a good way. I like that it really fits its format on the whole. But from the start, it's very contemplative, which I really like. It makes you kind of go inward, which is, I think, what the point of shoegaze was.
And this, it stops being, very quickly, it stops being an interlude for me. It becomes a full-fledged piece. It becomes true sound shaping, because the guitar goes into a very steady riff, but there are background tones that shape that guitar in such interesting ways that it really does take me places, even though you're in a very specific emotion here. And for me, this was a numb zone that I loved. Numb is not as in unemotional. Numb is a very specific feeling for me in which emotions have now overwhelmed you and you've shut off. That is a very distinct idea, and here I think they're really starting to capture it.
Yeah.
With that oscillation almost in the background, it did a great job of hitting that stride.
And this is also where the arc kind of went back to it kind of looped itself, lapped itself, because by this point, it's like we've reached the distortion cap. Well, we're not going to go further than we went in Double Dare. Instead, we're kind of going to go back to the beginning here. And I think in doing so, it took on a much more mature edge. First of all, in the very, very beginning of this track, you get like these murmurs of conversation just happening in the background. And then that ambient drone wants to sort of capture that moment. And it does so with this very warm guitar sound, which combines with these background drones, and then repeats that rhythmic motif that you were just talking about. Almost early rock, if you kind of stripped away the effects. If you just looked at that motif, it's very, very early rock. It's that old sort of major relative minor, teeter-tottering, E major, C sharp minor in this case. It sounds like it kind of wants to be a 50s love song if it wasn't caught in this haze of rumination perpetuated by those drones. And so it simply repeats the pattern endlessly, just numbingly. And towards the end, the drones actually take on what could almost be construed as full-form melody themselves, the light drones. It's meandering, but it still kind of supports the rest. So this is what I see your point in terms of actual progression within this track. And then the key thing, what I said earlier, capturing the moment. This is the first track which I feel is actually capturing something that is identifiable.
It's almost tangible.
Yeah, and it's first of all, this is the short track, correct? This is like
Yes.
a minute and 45 seconds.
Something like that.
Yeah, very, very short. It's an instrumental, and I think it really does accomplish more as an instrumental than most of the other tracks did accomplish with lyrics.
And the one thing I want to hone in on, because I forgot to mention it, is those background murmurs, and that's where I think it truly encapsulates Numb for me. Because it's that blocking out of true thought. The way it comes off as just a in the background is so nice to have, just adding context to the rest of what's going on there.
Well, I like that you use the word numb also in that way, because it's a different side of the same coin with contemplative, in the sense that you're either so overcharged by emotion that you shut off, or you're so focused in your mind that you're shut off. But it's this idea of everything else being kind of hollow around you as you're kind of going inward for whatever the reason is. And it really does convey that. I really do like
That's the key thing.
sense.
That's the key thing, and that's exactly what I guess what I always sort of got from the best of shoegaze. Shoegaze at its peak. I don't know what this. I mean, perhaps in terms of arc, it was trying to reach some, as I said, trying to reach some kind of critical mass point on this album, just prior to this track, before it finally releases. So, say, for instance, that double dare. Let's say we take it literally. Let's say a double dare is actually a double dare. Your back is up against the wall in some vague manner,
right.
And now all of a sudden it releases. You have to kind of go inward and just ruminate on whatever topic at hand, whatever is getting you, whatever is on your mind lately that you just can't shake. All of a sudden reaches critical mass, and now this is the moment where you just have to sit with it and I guess restructure whatever you have to do, reach that point of absolution. I don't know, but this is. This sums it up more effectively in this 1 minute and 45 seconds. Again, had to reach this point, but you're kind of left questioning until you reach it.
Right.
But this is an effective track.
But I like that this focus really does give you a textbook definition of shoegaze, especially the way you described it. This idea of, for whatever reason, it brought you inward, but now you're just staring down at your shoes while you ruminate for whatever reason. Well,
even also considering that arc, I like to kind of think of shoegaze as sort of the marriage of grunge and ambient, especially that early 90s sound. You bring together that harshness and then that really, really background drone, and then all of a sudden, well, you have this. Somewhere in the middle, it's still a full-fledged piece. It does go places, and again, this 1 minute 45 seconds went more places than the rest did, but that's what it is. That's the way I interpret it. From there we go to track 5, Nowhere Near. Now this was interesting because it starts off with that sort of cheesy holdover of 80s synth, which I thought was kind of a drift away from where we just were, and what you termed, John, as the cowboy guitar.
It's more. It's not southern rock. It's not country music. It's nothing of that sort. It's the theme notes to a cowboy walking into the bordello. It's the theme notes to the showdown. It's that pluck in the guitar that is him coming on scene. That's just where it went with my mind. That's what I saw.
It's such an oddball vision, but I guess the more and more I heard that riff over and over again, the more and more I started to kind of recognize it. It's a sparse riff. It feels like almost an incomplete phrase. You can't really call it a riff. It's just in major, it just goes 5 6 1, right? And it just goes back. Just turns to the tonic with that 5 6 1, and it feels like it should be going more places than this. It feels like it had a theme that it was going to enter into, but it never does. And this is like the fifth time that here we are, fifth track that they've done that. It seems to be their pattern. They stick with a riff or a motif or something, and then they just kind of do it to death. They treat that as their form of reaching in ambient environment. It becomes the pattern that after a while you don't even notice after a while, unless you do notice it, in which case it's probably not going to benefit the track.
In this case, I actually did enjoy it. I enjoyed the duality between the two pieces.
Very hit or miss.
It definitely can be. It's sort of the sounds kind of phase in and out around the vocals.
We have female vocals instead of male vocals here. It actually kind of reminded me of Mimi Parker from Low, which is, again, that, as I mentioned earlier, not more shoegaze. Very, very soft, very crooning. This was probably one of the nicer moments, at least in terms of vocal. It wasn't. It made it seem like, I guess, less of just that overlier, that it seemed like more of a croon than just the simple stream of consciousness diary entry thing. Still a little bit of that, but sweeter. Maybe just because simple female vocal edge.
But it's so background. I mean, this is the part where it's not even...
More foreground here in this track than others.
So low, so overpowered by some of the other instruments going on there that I feel like I have to strain just to hear her singing. That I have to strain to actually hear her voice coming through at certain parts. And it's not...
I didn't have to strain in this case for one reason. First of all, it sounded like her voice was kind of doubled. There may have been the male falsetto in the background, or it might have just been in mixing her voice doubled just lightly, or it was just an effect itself. But I kind of enjoyed that. It made her sound more distinct, more just like a straight up melody on this track that I think probably pushed it above where I had originally rated this. But in this case, it's a little bit different when you consider the lyrics. Do you know how I feel about you? Do you know this is real, how I feel about you? When I see you look at me, I'm not sure of anything. All I know is when you smile, I believe in everything. Now, that's a really, really sweet line. Also, leading up to this, it seems to come from, high school immaturity. But... it has its place.
It's a Dr. Seuss version of a love story, though. It's not really reaching many good heights for me.
But I didn't need the lyrics to get that. I didn't know the lyrics till I just looked at them now, and I already wrote that it was mellow and sweet. I got that from the music.
And you got the lyrics cheesy A synth?
Well, and the drone, and then the other instrumentation. I got that from the music. So, I mean, Steve, you talk about this a lot. Certain songs you should be able to get an emotionality or a feeling from the music aside from the lyrics, which I did. But also, if the lyrics are really just kind of perpetuating the same message, not really enhancing it, I feel like that kind of leaves me wanting. Not every song has to have strong lyrics, and the fact that there's an instrumentation of a sort from the vocals is okay, but I would have liked in this sweet song for the lyrics to have had more of an impact, at least in content.
But it captures it later, at least in terms of, all right, fine, here it's kind of high school. You're sort of idolizing this figure, and then later on we get to the point, well, do you know how I feel about you? Doesn't take much to tell that I love you. Everyone is here, but you're nowhere near. That's the title of the track, and just kind of reiterated. I suppose you could have gotten that, agreed, just from title, Nowhere Near, combined with the music itself, but I don't know, I've never heard this piece without the lyrics. Maybe I wouldn't have gotten the full emotion. Nowhere Near is a pretty vague title.
I disagree because I got the full emotion without the lyrics. I'll
agree with you that it is a 50s love song again. We kind of get that same deal. The chord progression, frankly, is as simple as they come. It's just 1-4-5, 1-4-5 over and over. I mean, that would almost be like blues if it wasn't just stuck in the loop. Same deal. It keeps it caught in the same exact haze, just like the little guitar riff is caught in the same exact loop. 5-6-1, 5-6-1. But this time it is sweeter, and especially considering you have female vocals here, this track resembles what earlier tracks did, or what we did kind of by culminating with Double Dare and then taking it down a notch with Superstar Watcher, and that's the fact that the track kind of got interrupted. The distorted guitar just steps in and muddles everything together. It was a really, really interesting moment for this. Again, things are just coming apart, unraveling, right around the time where she breaks it down, but you're nowhere near. No, you're nowhere near.
I did not enjoy that in this case. This is might be a preference or something like that, but it got a little too murky. It got a little too cluttered for me.
I wasn't super moved by it, but
it felt like all it was doing was just adding as additional glue on the tapestry that they were painting with this song. It wasn't adding
additional
color.
Glue on the album, rather, because of the little reflection.
But it wasn't. It wasn't another color. It was just another gray hue thrown in. It wasn't something that I felt added to it.
The unfortunate reality for me is I honestly didn't remember the female vocalist was in this track until you brought it up.
That's a shame.
It is a shame. It is really a shame, and I agree. It's a horrible shame. But honestly, if it didn't leave enough of an impact, it's not...
Well, this is also inevitable in the course of a 1 week listen, and then going back through our notes and then trying to sort it all out.
It could be that,
but it's true. Now, I get your point. There I keep saying muddiness, but there's a muddiness to the album as a whole that sometimes
it bleeds together a little bit.
Yeah.
Anyway, I think this is a great place to move on to the 6th track called "Sudden Organ," which I love because I want to imagine that they titled it for the reason that simply the song starts suddenly with an organ. So the band was so excited that they suddenly had an organ in their album that they're like, let's call it Sudden Organ.
Yes, a little bit of cheekiness at this point.
I don't know that it is actually the reason. I feel like it could
I'm sure that is. I mean,
Yeah,
it's
you
a
think
quivering organ that begins, and I mean, granted, all organs quiver, but this had some motion to it. There was the first, I think it's the tantamount to a climax, I think, with this album in terms of just its volume peak. It had a lot of motion to it, especially by the time the drums came in. The drums
rhythm.
themselves, the rhythm is really solid. It's got this very...
It's significantly more fleshed out as well by adding in those shakers.
Well, it's that rounded, kind of pitch-encompassing drum style. The kind that I also noted back in sort of middle period TV on the radio. They like to do a lot of that stuff. Very, very heavy in the drums, where it feels like the drums are paramount, the prominent figure. And again, it goes back to your earlier point, where if in the rest of this album there is the issue of lacking a prominent figure, well, then this kind of succeeds in one area. First by the organ, then by the drums.
And also with the vocals, and also with the guitar. Everything seems to be coming together more cohesively here in propelling one another forward. Because the vocals, in my opinion, this is probably the best vocals on the album up until this point. Might be the best vocals on the album as a whole.
Really?
They feel more sustained. They feel less meekness is involved here.
Well, I
There's
felt
a little more
less
confidence.
meekness, interestingly, in the female vocals, because they kind of took that sort of flat but smooth Mimi Parker edge. Here, I don't know. I don't think I saw exactly or heard exactly what you heard with the vocals, because it felt like they were back to prior. They were taking the back seat. I felt the organ as the forefront. I mean, you kind of can't take your mind off of it in many instances. Even in the comping, it feels very present, and it's certainly present later on during the extremely manic solo that it has.
But the guitar was also doing its thing along with the rhythm, and the guitar here feels like it's got a better purpose. A bigger purpose than what it had in previous tracks. Okay. I feel like the guitar is actually moving the song along instead of being the safe riff over and over again. Because while we're not undergoing great metamorphosis here, it does feel like it's propelling.
Well, another thing that moves the song along is the C, the bass just falling down. It's all in like C major. It kind of falls down actually in C mixolydian, just C, B flat, A, G, and we don't really seem to leave that chord very much. In general, it's just all C major, but more C mixolydian because it seems to be B flats just everywhere thrown around here, and that seems to be the pattern that I also Again, there's always a pattern that these tracks go back to, and that in this case, that's it. And I couldn't really take my mind off of it after a while, and that was a negative.
Well, I think that even though this song seemed at the forefront more accessible, possibly more engaging, it was, and even though less repetitive, I felt like I guess that's a toss-up. But I feel like even though the song was more accessible, I didn't enjoy it more. And typically, I mean, we poo-poo on accessibility, but the reality is you sometimes want artists to have moments of accessibility. However, I feel like I didn't really want accessibility here. I wanted them to continue what some of these other songs were building to, this arc in the album.
That goes back to the climax notion that I mentioned earlier. The idea that, this is a climax for the album only because it seems to step out of their shoes a little bit, right? But true to its form, in doing so, it steps away from where they excel best. And they excel best in their shoegaze territory, as we've proven so far and will be proven again. The only advantage is, of course, that probably, I don't know, I think it depends on how you define enjoyment. If you define enjoyment as busyness, well then, marginally speaking, this track might get you a little bit more. But I don't think that's where this album was going.
I don't know that I used the word enjoyment.
Did you?
No.
You enjoyed this track less, I thought you said. Or more.
I said it was
I don't know.
More accessible.
Very fine lines.
Anyway. Well, the other tracks were murmuring, were quiet. Guys just can't quite get the words out. They were trying to say something, but you have to strain to hear. This is just someone rambling off in the corner. maybe a little bit too loud. There's just too much going on here to make it really flow into and out of this song. For me, individually, might be my favorite track as far as ones with vocals, because there's another song without vocals coming up that I thoroughly love. But it's still less about the cohesion of the actual album. It may be the climax, but the climax is a little out of sync with everything else.
Yeah, this is a very roundabout way of describing this. Just flat out, okay, we've accepted shoegaze. That's probably what you're going to this album for. In which case, you're going to get a few tracks which really, really push that further. But you know what? If you also happen to be really, really big on organ, we're gonna just cross that niche. All right, that's as much as it comes, and I think they were very cheeky, as I said at the outset, even just by titling this sudden organ, because they knew exactly what they were doing just that. They were throwing that in there, a random thing amidst a fan base that is otherwise probably not here for the organ. And by the time we get to the solo, I suppose that's pushed even further, because it's like distortion for organ. This is where the organ really, really takes the forefront, because it pushes this kind of manic state as of this point on the track, let alone at this point of the album. It's jerky, it's all over the place. There's lots of like tonal clusters in here, just jamming the notes together. That's the way it kind of fills out the dissonant edge, and it's filled with some kind of stress. I don't know, at least I don't know what character this is supposed to embody, but especially by the time we're looking at the lyrics, like toward the end here. I forget whether there were lyrics to follow this solo or not, but just take this for example. Well, I don't know, but I'm pretty sure that I want to shoot it in the back. As the days go by, I'm stepping on them all like ants, and I've seen the way that they look at you. Or maybe not a guess. We'll know it after a while. I'm wondering just how this will stop. How's it going to stop?
I like that.
Yeah.
In a different context. I mean, that would have been really cool in maybe a punk song or a true grunge song, but to have it sort of scatterbrains, a little bit manic when you're really going more depression in the previous parts and the further parts of this album, it's just that weird outburst. It's just that.
But the funny thing is, vocally, and we said this already, that there's no actual outburst going on here. As far as I hear it, the lines, especially the line you reacted to, when I'm pretty sure that I want to shoot it in the back, pretty sure that is the same level, unchanging overlay that the vocals have always done since the beginning of this album.
And that's where it becomes even odder for this
well, odder also because then you figure someone is very calmly, I don't know,
talking about murder.
Well, yeah, obviously it's probably like an issue and it's metaphorical and all that stuff, but it's an uncomfortable moment, and yes, even more uncomfortable by how calm he says it.
I'm angry.
Yeah.
I'm furious.
Yeah, but that's like the diary entry that later on people are going to read after you've done something stupid. Yeah,
it's sort of the repetition.
So we're saying a page out of John's diary at some point.
I don't write a diary. I dictate.
But Thank God you don't.
But before we move into the next track, though, like my problem with the organ, though, too, is it's very standoutish in the beginning, and then by the end, it becomes a caricature of itself, and I just feel like
that solo does a lot to do that.
Yeah, and also it's that classic solo. You're getting carried away with yourself a little bit, especially by the time the rhythm starts getting really jerky. It's cool, but it's cool for a different medium. Just like John said earlier, in a different context. There's so many things about this track that I think would be cool in a different context. But from there, I think it's about time to go on to A Worrying Thing, track 7.
And if the previous track would be the climax of the album, I feel like A Worrying Thing really is the best representation of the album as a whole. It's soul, if you really want to get that deep into it. Because it's not too low. It's not those levels of quiet, of contemplative, of numbness that you were really getting in the very beginning of the track. It seems to have a little more superstar watcher in it.
Yeah.
It has that easygoingness to it, but it remains enjoyable throughout the song.
Another reason for that is, of course, New element of texture here. A guitar that almost sounds acoustic. I don't think it is acoustic. I actually think it's a very tinny, possibly very bright electric guitar. But it almost comes across as sounding acoustic. After that, it's just kind of jamming in major. Very uplifting, but at the same time almost deadening at the same time. It's an oddball.
I'd said it kind of almost felt kind of folky. And the way you describe it, it does fit that kind of folk framework. I also really like that the song had that rolling drum work. You know, this is another song where we're getting an interesting rhythm that accentuates the song, but doesn't overtake it. And then it's got that mellow nature that the early track, the first track had, that kind of all rolled together gives this conveyance of contemplativeness again, which we go back to.
But it was still a two-dimensional track, and in this case, it being only the kind of contemplative, ooh, you got some depth, but also a little worrisome, that combination of the two pieces was good enough. It was good enough for me to enjoy this track. I'm not looking for a lot of, like, real existential, why are we here in the universe type introvertedness.
I think this album is a mild skirt of that concept. That's about it. I mean, from, let's say, the 18-year-old concept, but their concept of the existential reality, which is pretty meek.
Well, it's also that they've kind of got an everyday life outlook on all of the tracks. All of the lyrics kind of go in that direction. I mean, even for this one, will you ever say what I fear you're dying to say? Well, I don't mind if you don't think about it. Like, it's all the lyrics are very straightforward.
Let me take that a step further here, because there was an interesting moment about, there's an interesting thing about those lyrics combined with the vocals here, because just as we've been describing the vocals as being kind of flat, just simply there. Here, it's almost like a murmur in the background. Mm-hmm. It's like they went even softer still. So when you revisit those lyrics, will you ever say what I fear you're dying to say? Well, I don't mind if I don't think about it. Another sleepless night, reading over by the only light, but I don't mind if I don't think about it. What scares me most, I'll keep from you. If you want me to, I'll keep from you. Does it make sense to you, getting old, living life, 22? Well, actually, flat out, age right there. Not quite 18, but not far from it. Well, I don't mind if I don't think about it. Let's go far away, let's leave today. If you want us to, we'll leave today. Will you ever say? There's longing in here. There's distinct longing.
Absolutely.
But at the same time, so it's not so much a matter of existential crisis as much as it is the fear that goes with all the problems that will probably lead you to an existential crisis if things don't quite go your way.
It is interesting the way the author is putting it here. The idea of don't think about purple elephants. Once someone says that to you, like, you're going to think about
purple elephants.
But here he's
it's impossible
actually,
not to.
It's the actual partitioning of I won't think about it, so I can be happier. Not happy. Mind you, not happy at all, but happier.
Hence, uplifting, almost deadening, as I described. And I think that's a pretty valid way to go about it, especially considering that's what I described a lot of that TV and the radio album was about. Seeds, which we reviewed back in episode 122, not too long ago. That, again, was, well, let's go toward the uplifting, let's deaden out the reality. If I don't think about it, then it's not true. And I felt like that album in many ways kind of failed. At least this succeeds in terms of lyrical content, combined with the fact that as immediately, as soon as the song started, I was like, all right, well, this is very uplifting. At the same time, I feel kind of dead inside.
Yeah,
I feel kind of weak.
It helps by that vocal work. This is the time that it's really shining.
Hence, the lyrics do have a purpose here, more so than previous cases. When you read them, you really do kind of get that extra element that you might not otherwise have gotten.
But the difference is you have to read them, and that's a fault. It's
no,
not.
I said in the beginning, I already get the idea. The lyrics are simply it's the diary entry that pushes you a step further. Right. You get the general concept. Now you have the story.
All right, that makes sense.
It's valid. I'm not saying it's a perfect way to go about it. I'm just saying
it's what they're clearly trying to do,
and that's why I call this song the soul of the album. The pinnacle idea of what this album is trying to do.
Yeah.
It does. It's a great representation of shoegazing.
I don't think you'd get any argument from either of us about that. I think we're all kind of in agreement of that.
Yeah, well, if it's labeled as such, then you won't. All right, track 8. I Was the Fool Beside You for Too Long.
So, this song, I like how the intro is kind of tinkering. You know, they're not really kind of... This is the first time we're not getting an all-out something that's taking a step in the direction of where the song is going. It tinkers in the intro. It's a very slow build. They milk it for all it's worth. They kind of bring in each instrument piece by piece. It's a very piecemeal song, which I really like. And
that's to its credit. Milking it is exactly what I think we've been lacking on this album. Here we get it. It get this slow but prominent bass line, and it kind of mixes with this slightly tinny, almost chime-like guitar riff. It might have even been harmonics, if I recall. But interesting little tonal variance here. What you get is just, in this sort of slow rhythm, you know, just in 4/time, it'll really harp on that flat 7 here, that little Mixolydian thing, where on the 4th beat, it just throws in this flat 7, and then the rest of the measure is usually anchored in major. It's almost that for pretty much the entire song, or rather teetering back and forth between that and 4 measures where it goes down to a minor 5. Even so, I think the minor 5 is really more implied rather than being there. It's all power chords, so you don't really get full impressions of things. It's just again, distant impressions. That's kind of typical for this album so far. But when the beat steps in alongside it, because you get that thump after several measures of this, that really starts pushing it forward. I think it's kind of... It's strange what a fine line we're walking, when in many ways this track is using the same tools, but certain little things just seem to be more delicate, more thought out.
It fits. It feels like it fits together better. It's just, you know, everything is at the right level. They're working together. It's almost as if they're all building and winding together around that bass line.
Like in other tracks, they were forcing puzzle pieces together. This time,
they just fit nicely.
Yeah, there's an identity going on here. This track knows where it's going to end up. It's not going to just show you a picture and then just that picture remains unchanging. There is some actual shaping going on here.
And true to that concept, of course, you get lyrics that aren't really... They don't need to go far beyond the title itself, because the music does it. And this is pretty much exactly what you were hopping on in the last track, Matt, and that's the fact that this track, music says it all. All you have is the lyrics here is just basic, I was the fool beside you. I was the fool beside you for too long. The only variance you get is the things about you that would drive me wild still drive me wild, but now in a different way. Interesting little moment there, which makes you kind of scratch your head a little bit as to why they would choose that thought to be the standoutish lyrical concept, especially considering you've probably already drowned out the lyrics by this point and immersed yourself in the music.
Well, because like I said, when talking about the vocals for this song, the vocals fit the kind of mix as far as sound-wise, but what they're saying really didn't matter for this song. And reading the lyrics kind of proves that they're meant to just kind of be this flowy part of the background, and they serve that purpose.
Sure. This is where the wall of sound that they had been doing in a lot of the other songs, here it actually has some texture going on. It has...
I think it's all about progression more so than texture.
It has content.
It offers no influx of texture to a further extent than many of the other tracks. It's really more about... It's about the layering. It's about the timing, execution, and progression, whereas other tracks were for the most part, flat. They picked their concept, and that had to be your still shot. Yeah. That you either accepted at the outset or you left it. This track, there is room for expansion.
There's growth, there's narrative. Yeah, it really kind of does flow.
It's actually a very, very simple way of describing what we often come to, where we come to blows in many other tracks and many other albums, where we're grappling with that point of, well, what is your goal here? Are you trying to build a still shot, or are you trying to actually form a message? And the funny thing is that I think this is it's forming a still shot within its progression, within its little musical storytelling, because the message is only the title. I was the fool beside you for too long. You know it the second you start playing, and yet you kind of get the story over the course of this, marginally speaking, but you get it. I can't convey that any simpler.
It is actually there.
All right. Track 9, The Whole of the Law Loops, which is actually a cover. It was a cover even when it was released in '93, originally by The Only Ones. And The lyrical content is the same, but they pushed this far beyond what that original track was.
I got nothing for this song. I don't know. It didn't really do much for me. I felt like
it was stale.
This was closer to the earlier
pure
stuff that I had issues with. I agree, John. It's just it didn't really do anything or go anywhere. And after we had such a great track before it, I just felt it fell flat.
This is the track that decided to actually give us a 4-chord progression, and it was a pretty standard 4-chord progression in that. It's sort of a 1, minor 3, minor 6, and 4. You might find this in Oasis's Wonderwall, albeit faster, to the point where it's not really comparable. Same deal in Foster the People, Pumped Up Kicks. Same chord progression, but none of them as soft as this particular track. I found it pleasant, but I can't argue with you on stale. It seemed that there was another vocalist stepping in there, which made me kind of consider Simon and Garfunkel for a time. I actually thought, obviously they've written immensely more complex tracks, but at least just in the vocal quality, I was given the same soothing edge as I might get from Simon and Garfunkel, or say Kings of Convenience, something like that. It was pleasant, but that was just in the vocals, and then I have very little to say about the music itself.
It's just it wasn't very memorable. It wasn't very engaging, and again, I think we got such a brilliant 8th track that the 9th track was doomed to.
Can't call the 8th track brilliant.
Well,
and
not
then
brilliant.
At the same time,
I'm overreacting, but I just feel like the 8th track had much more of an impact, so the 9th fell that much flatter because there was literally no impact.
And it's a shame because I think the 9th really did have potential. I think that this very soft framework was building something interesting, and of course they do change up that 4-chord progression.
Yeah, but they've done soft stuff like this on other parts of the record that had more meaning, and it was an original, whereas this is they chose to cover something and didn't really do much with it.
Oh, well, compared to the track they covered, they did something with it.
Okay, but compared to everything else in the album, they didn't really do much with it.
That I would agree with.
It may very well just have been a point of convenience,
Filler?
considering that the lyrics themselves probably fit the overall goal that they were driving at. You know, it's a love song in a way, but I like that concept of the whole of the law loops, like this recurrence of events, cyclical nature of life, as it were. I'll escape from my change and I'll reach out to you. Maybe I'm in love with you. Maybe I'm in love with you. I had to contact you. Found out I was in love with you. I had to contact. That's it. That's the law. That's the whole of the law. It's inevitable that I will contact you. That kind of.
And has a little bit of the creep factor that.
It's got it.
You got that. But
the funny thing is, actually, the original was pretty creepy when you consider the vocals.
Yeah.
The original from 1978 by the Only Ones. Not exactly high art, but it was interesting. It was interesting.
Definitely worth hearing, I guess, just for the sake of
context.
Yeah. From here we go.
All music is worth hearing, man. You know that.
I might argue that for some music.
At a later date.
Anyway, the next track 10, is actually a return to the first track. Big Day Coming, second version.
So sort of a reprise.
Remix.
Reprise. Well, actually, yeah, more than a remix than a reprise.
Yeah, it was. They rebuilt the song. It's a whole 3 minutes shorter because it moves faster. So it's heavier, faster, more erratic. Still kind of repetitive and still kind of uninspired.
I found like the second track, this drifted more toward the grunge than it did the shoegaze.
Yeah.
It tried to grunge it up a little bit.
I felt that the song held more weight when it was more shoegaze. When they grungified it, it just felt. It still felt repetitive.
But then you got to consider goal. At this point in the album, I feel like nothing has been resolved. Absolutely nothing.
Right.
We have come from a track. I would consider this from a thematic standpoint.
Right.
We've come from a track where he had to contact you. He had to go out there. He had to put his balls in the line, and now the big day is still coming. We are back to the beginning. It adds
an inevitability to the album.
Do you get the sense, perhaps, like I do, that this was not his reaching out was not met with the best of results?
Probably.
Or maybe he's still going. And one thing that might even speak to that theme work is the melody in this song. I feel like it's an incomplete melody. We've talked about this in the past
in the first track we said too. It was
this right here, it was like. And it's not something I would normally notice, but here it just felt like it was right in my face. it felt like there were notes just physically missing in this song.
No,
for me.
like, you mean missing compared to the first track?
No, missing from what they were doing with
Even
the melody.
even in the first track.
Not even. I'm ignoring the first track. I'm looking at this piece. I feel like there's something lacking.
I don't know. I think
in what's going on.
Yeah.
Well,
I think what's lacking is any sort of.
She's lacking.
Yeah,
in his life.
It's the repetitiveness.
The big day's still coming. It's coming around.
And I felt this one was more repetitive than the first track, probably because it was sped up. So they're moving through it faster, but then so you're getting that guitar riff over and over and over again at a more quicker pace. So you're getting bored faster. Whereas at least in the first track,
because now it's more urgent. Big day's coming. I'm telling you, it's gonna happen for me this time.
It didn't do it for me. I didn't need a second version. I
think that when you consider that concept, I
get thematically. I still didn't really like it.
So you're at that old split. Well, that's fair, but I think it's interesting to, not unlike kind of what we had to deal with in Future Island singles, the concept of ruminating over a relationship that may or may not have existed. Well, here, this is the going through the motions that I think a lot of people have to deal with. Okay, well, you reached out, it failed, you pick up, you move back along, but you're a little bit defeated, you're not quite the same person. I think this so far, again, the title of the album is called Painful. There's no debating at this point whether that's what it's about. It's just now whether you felt it was successful or not. And I think there's just that one thing missing, which is the overall passion that you might expect to go with all these tracks. But that's not the route that this album is taking. The album so far is taking it's taking the back seat. In other words, you try, you fail, you pick up, you're a little bit deadened. Well, that's actually closer to life, frankly, than all of the rousing, passionate, love and loss tracks or albums that we usually receive. I guess I kind of appreciate it for that. But maybe it's not the best thing to be listening to in a time where you're actually dealing with said issue. I don't know. Let's wrap this up as of the last track. Track 11, I Heard You Looking.
So this is another instrumental track. We, from the get-go, get a very sorrowful, contemplative feel. We're back into shoegaze again. But the groove backbone of the song still kind of builds. It's not as plain as some of the other tracks. It does build, which we really liked in track 8, and I'm glad it's back here.
And that's not to say the track isn't repetitive, that it isn't repeating the same riff over and over again. But here, I am very, very much interested in this riff. I very much am enjoying what's going on here. This feels like, and this is one of the main issues I have with what's been going on with this album, this feels like the individuals actually are focusing on the track itself, on the song itself, in that they're not checking out. They're not just playing to keep making music. They're playing because they have a very specific idea in mind. It's almost refreshing.
Well, I give it this, at least from the musical standpoint. Again, it just utilizes that one note to just change the chord. It's just the single bass note variance. And, alright, maybe it wasn't as strong of an item before. This time it's a little bit stronger because it seems like there was more motion within that. It wasn't just the simple, like C, B flat, A, G that we got before. Instead, now it's a little bit more all over the place. The guitar itself kind of meanders along, but this time it feels tethered to an emotional melodic center as opposed to its ramble. But then again, it kind of rambles in its own right, yet that in itself feels melodic.
And the song does have a focus, which I really like. It is still building around other things, like we had touted in the other songs that we really liked. It doesn't seem completely aimless. Only parts of it does.
It was more like a well-inspired improvisation.
Yes, and I think I like it as a conclusion also because it feels like, according to your theme and arc that you're talking about, it feels very much like the big day's coming again. It feels like most of this album was a failure as far as emotionally, he's still back at square one. So now he's back to contemplating and feeling down because he's back at square one. It's like, all of it was for nothing, which is, I think, overall, thematically, what this album is trying to convey emotionally.
Sure.
Is that it was all pointless. What was the point? Why even bother?
Exactly.
And you really get a sense of that from that song. And to feel very
wow,
much...
90s angst at its peak.
It really is. And it kind of gives a cohesion to this album that I didn't see originally. I'll admit, I still have issues with this record. But thematically and art-wise, there's a cohesion that cannot be ignored. And the idea of working so hard to convey a futile non-change, something completely futile, is actually kind of awesome to me. I think that futility, especially in the 90s, as someone who grew up in the 90s, being in high school, being angsty, there is this futility that you feel like every day, what's the point? I go to school, I get picked on, I go home, I'm miserable. I go to school, I'm picked on, I go home, I'm miserable.
I was 5. I don't think I knew those problems yet.
Shut up. Thank you for making me feel older. But yeah, so I think it's a strong way to wrap up this album.
And wrapping up, I guess we'll start.
Do you want to...
You can.
All right, break it up, John. He was on a roll, though.
I was on a roll. All right, fine. I'll take us into the wrap up. I'll give John a freebie this week. I don't know. I don't know why I sounded so aggressive. I really have no reason to be.
Just sitting over.
Anyway,
I'm so hurt.
You'll get over it. So
now that this album is ending.
So dealing with "Painful" by Yo La Tengo. Here's my problem with this record. Let's start with my problems. I, of all of us, usually have no issue with a band that's a little repetitive because I can forgive it in place of content. But at least some of the other bands we reviewed that have felt repetitive in moments, like one of my favorite 90s bands, Eve 6, we've talked about how some of their music feels a little samey, but it has standout moments. The difference is I can always latch on to Eve 6 lyrics. I love their vocalist, Max Collins, and they're very message heavy. I mean, Steve said that with that album, for something that was harkening back to the 90s, the emotional message was a through line that really carried that record. Here, lyrically, there's nothing to really latch onto unless you read it. Now, yes, I will agree with Steve's point earlier that if you do read the lyrics after listening to the record, it does add a context to it that you might not have gotten, and that really does build it out. But ultimately, I still have to file it under fault. Because ultimately, I feel, with music, you should be able to get everything out of it just from hearing it. Now, admittedly, John's always stated with lyrics, if you listen to an album enough times, you can really get a sense of the lyrics even if you didn't originally, which is also a good point. However, I listened to this album 5 or 6 times, and I still don't remember any of the lyrics. To me, that's a problem. Musically, there are moments that I really like. And again, the songs that were distinctly shoegaze, a genre I've never heard of till today, but I'm excited to actually go explore more and maybe check out their other records. The whole album didn't feel shoegaze. The rest of the album felt a mishmash of other stuff too, which again, maybe that's why this album is touted as one of their best, is because of the amalgamation of stuff that they pulled together, even though they tended to be mostly in shoegaze. But that wasn't enough for me. However, I cannot ignore such a strong arc and theme. Especially talking about it the way we wrapped up and the way I wrapped it up. Digging deep into my own very gloomy high school years. Feeling a perpetual inevitability to fail is terrifying and horrifying. And this album kind of gives that cycle of a big day's coming, you're building up to it, you're working it out, you're making moves, you're trying to figure out what's what, and then at the end, ultimately, that big day's still coming, and you have changed nothing. Nothing's different. Nothing's better. It's just where it was. You're still ruminating in the sorrowful contemplation that you started with. That was fairly powerful for me, but I wanted more from this album musically. I need a tissue. I really felt like I needed something more musically, and that's where it's going to hurt itself. But as a band, they're not average. You know, they do some interesting things. I wanted more rumination and contemplativeness. I didn't want songs like Double Dare, although paired with Superstar Watcher gave it more. But, for example, From a Motel 6, Sudden Organ, even A Whirring Thing, even though I like it, You know, and then of course the redux of A Big Day Comes and the cover of the whole of the Law Loops. I just felt like these songs kind of hurt what the overall shoegaze sound could have been, but it does play into the theme that Steve mentioned. So you couldn't really have this album arc and theme without it. So it makes me conflicted, which is why I've gone on so long about it. But ultimately, I think where I lie with a rating is it's not a 4. There are just too many faults I feel with it that I can't give it a 4. You know, based on what we were talking about, even Aphex Twin last week, there's a level of skill and talent in every track that you cannot deny. Whereas here, I just didn't feel it in every track. I needed more. So it's a 3.75 for me. It's not perfectly average. I don't think it's a 3.5 because I feel like there's more to it than there if you really look. But it's not a 4. It's not... Actually, I'm going to bring it back, dial it back to a 3.6. 3.75 even adds a level of something that's not there. So a 3.6. It's not perfectly average. It's not even perfectly average. It's just 3.6.
We should just change all of our rating systems to it's not average, but average, then there's average, and then there's just kind of average.
This album does a great job in describing ambivalence. It is such a perfect way of saying that. Even I was the fool beside you for too long, which is sort of a calling out kind of a song, lyrically and even emotionally, with the build-up and everything like that. But then again, he never says, I'm leaving you or anything like that. He's still like, I was stupid for being with you.
Well, maybe I'm going to interrupt you before your explanation of that, but I feel like Matt was more on the ball here. I feel like ambivalence is not the word, especially for an album titled Painful.
It's a painful area, true. I'll go with that.
Perhaps there's an ambivalent front.
No, it's all about being indecisive. Every single track just about is about being indecisive. Of not being able to go one way or the other. Right. And I think that also speaks to the music itself. At times, it felt like it was going to be ethereal. It's going to be a soundscape. It was going to be ambient. And at times, it was trying to be a little bit concrete. But those ideas kept clashing. It kept it from really culminating in one or the other. It's a dreamlike state, but it's a dream you're not going to remember. It's going to be something you forget right away. It's not even going to be one of those weird dreams where you're holding a banana, you don't know what you're doing with it, but you're talking into it, and you're talking to Richard Nixon, and you're talking about the war, or something weird that your mind just shoots off on. No, this is, you're dreaming about work, and you forget it when you wake up. There's nothing, like, powerful, impactful about that that's going to stick with you. And maybe that's to its credit. Maybe that speaks to the idea of what they were going for here when you start talking about shoegaze. But frankly, that might be too far gone. Because with songs like Superstar Watcher, I Heard You Looking, and really A Worrying Thing, and I Was a Fool Beside You for Too Long, all really solid tracks. Even like Double Dare and Nowhere Near approached ideas of that I really liked, and they were shoegaze. Maybe a little bit of punk, maybe a little bit of grunge, maybe a little bit of this, that, and everything thrown in there. But they were that guy in the background who has a lot going on in his mind. All right, there's things going there. He just can't articulate it, which kind of sums up shoegaze pretty well for me on a personal level. But sometimes there is just nothing for them to articulate, nothing for them to say. They start a thought and exactly that. They just stop. They don't know where they're going with it. And that's a big problem because they're tackling an idea here which I think they did excellently. I just don't know if it was the best real theme to work on here. The best idea to go with here. And that's where I'm really drawing a lot of problems. So there's no technicality here in the instruments or the vocals. That's going to be bouncing it up for me to hone in on. There's so not enough besides theme going on here, and that's just so hit and miss with me right now. 3.25. it's really not it's not a great album. It's good. It's a great concept, maybe. I guess that's what it boils down for me. It's a great concept that I think they executed well, but I don't think was strong enough for the concept itself.
Well, segueing from your maybe, I think this has a more solid theme than many other albums we stretched to. I mean, for instance, if we're just even looking as recently as last week, Aphex Twin's album, me and you were pretty solid with that album's theme, John. Mm-hmm. It's not, but see, even that in itself is a more distant theme. And that's the concept of, impressionist concepts that will change over the course of time. This is more on the nose, and this is something that is kind of documentable because you actually have the lyrics at that end. And one of the reasons why I like instrumentals, though, is because it does leave you guessing, and it's why last week's album was so fun to review. This time around, we're given the answers somewhat. They may not have jumped out to us at first, but you kind of knew going in that you were going to get something that was pretty difficult to grapple with, pretty introverted, and that's just by the nature of what I described to you at the outset of what shoegaze is: staring at your shoes, thinking about life, even on stage, can't escape from it, even when you're jamming out, which in many ways is other people's escape. Well, nope, for you, that's just another moment to think about life and try to convey it in some sense. And I think this album is a pretty interesting way to convey it. I think Matt already said he stacked it up exactly as to why I enjoy this from a theme perspective, and he also summed up why it suffers a little bit just because of the fact that the music itself. I think the main deal here is that the passion was absent. Now, perhaps that's just the deal when you're looking at something that's angsty. The passion isn't always going. You don't always want to revisit that passion, because if you do visit the passion that comes from being angsty, it's probably going to be a mess. It's going to be ugly, and it'll probably be more akin to something that was punk. This is a little bit subdued. It's the diary entry. It is the flat, earnest representation of who you are from the horse's mouth. And it conveys that pretty well. How could it convey anything else? I mean, it's from the horse's mouth. And then, of course, it's very down to earth. It's very downtrodden, but also not all diary entries should be published. You know, it's interesting. It's always intriguing to look back on. And I think that much like some diary entries that have been published, there can be some solid culture there, just from looking really deeply into the life of one person and seeing the trials and tribulations that led them to a particular conclusion, or in this case, a particular restarting of the same problem, which was really, really tough to deal with. And I sympathize. By the time that I read these lyrics, which, as Matt said, you have to, then you start to really, really empathize with this guy, with this character. And that's not even counting, of course, the tracks which include female vocals, where he tries to offer a little bit of both sides of the story, but it relieves me in the same exact conflict that you were at, Matt. And in attempting to reach the same conclusion, I don't know if I'm going to reach the same number or not. I think I have to go back to my musical go-tos, which are really important. That's what it is in the end. In the end, you're looking at music. You're not looking for, let me buy this 1999 theme. No, that's not what people do at Best Buy or FYE. They get music, and the music, if it gives you something right off the bat, theme wise, well, that's brilliant. Then someone really hit a high note. No pun intended. But the deal is when looking at the elements of this album, the things that they do bring together, I appreciate it for what it did in 1993 in terms of genre fusion. I think that was really important the more I consider the amount of things that were brought together. When we listened to this initially at the outset, we were like, really? it's not even for 1993. It didn't seem to really be like, some kind of culminating point, let alone for them, let alone for music. But I really think it is. It's subtle, but it's there. And perhaps it opened the door to all the stuff that followed in later shoegaze and then post-rock and other various genres that pursued more contemplative sides of things. That said, though, in each case, we've grappled with the lack of moment. Instead, these explore long-form things, and you can't take this album piece by piece. You have to take it as the album. You have to take it front to back. If you take out, let's say, a minute segment here, then you're dealing with problematic. That doesn't even begin to cover it. You're looking at a whole, a piece of something that probably wouldn't intrigue. Not to say that you should judge a great novel by just looking at a paragraph. You see how this keeps going back and forth here? Unfortunately, when it comes to music, I've often cited that it is often about the moments. I think it's the moments where this album suffers. It doesn't attempt to convey anything strongly in any particular moment here, whereas it should. It should have. Instead, you're just left with the requirement upon purchase to look at the lyrics and read along with them, because the vocalist is not bellowing them. He's saying them to himself. That's I think the biggest problem, which will certainly not bring this to a 4. I think I'm right where you are, Matt. I think I'm at a 3.6, because a 3.6 pretty accurately conveys how this is just a little bit above that rounded like average good album 3.5. I think this is a very interesting concept in terms of its track by track notions, and the music falls short, but it does convey it in a loose sense if you're open-minded. That's it.
Tying this back to originally what we had talked about last week in Steve's rush to mention a band that he was excited that had something new and didn't realize it was actually not new, or sort of new, Extra Painful, which is the re-release. On Spotify, specifically, and actually in stores, I imagine, though I have not purchased it myself. I listened to it on Spotify. It's a dual disc. The first disc is the original album, Painful. The second disc is demos, unreleased tracks, live tracks, extra stuff. Extra Painful. I see what they did there. Anyway, they give you extras of Painful.
What are we, an hour, 30 minutes?
I don't know. Anyway, so what I want to talk about is, do dual discs matter anymore? I mean, I remember, for example, there's another album recently that I realized, not on Spotify, but if you purchase the physical record, is a dual disc. It's MC Chris's latest record, Forever. There's like 5 R's at the end of it. Is a dual disc when you purchase it, but on Spotify is one disc. There's no breakup, no spacing, whereas on a lot of other dual discs on Spotify, they actually space them out by disc. Why? I'm guessing
discs.
I'm guessing
Your Spotify.
I know. Guessing with this record, because one is the actual record and the other is the extra stuff, they wanted to space it out. Whereas MC Chris, it's one flow of narrative and theme that just happens to be too long for one disc.
But that's a pretty long CD, then.
But
that's a pretty long album to be more than one disc.
I think it's over an hour and a half.
That's a real long album.
I think he'd been working on it for a while too. But my question is, ultimately, with all of this rambling, is, do we still need dual discs? Can't we just put it all on one disc, or in a digital age, just mush it all together like MC Chris did?
Well, if I may be the first panelist to chime in here, since you posed such an interesting question, I think the main purpose, because of course I understand your gripe. The gripe is pretty valid, even if this is just poking at a small element of music etiquette, music marketing etiquette. Why do it? Why do it simply because we're past the point of even referring to things, regardless of the fact that we still call records, even though they aren't records anymore? Why still separate things by discs if we're probably not going to have discs anymore? Well, I would say precedent is the main reason. That's the easy answer. But there's a reason behind that precedent. Just like there's a reason behind the precedent of still calling records, is that they were recorded. That was always the reason. We don't pick up a CD, for instance, and still call them vinyls. That would be asinine. Nevertheless, there's a reason behind behind what you pose, and that is, of course, the purpose that splitting discs serve. we experience them as a gap. We experience them as an intermission, an entr'acte.
Okay.
Now, this, of course, the reason for that goes back to, like, 15th century opera, in which case you're dealing with very, very long forms of art where people had to sit in a room for long periods of time during
with the unwashed masses.
With the unwashed, exactly. You know, showering wasn't exactly standardized, but
it gets hot.
It gets hot. What are you going to do? Of course, break it up. You know, let people get some air. Otherwise, they're not going to be caring about your art that you painstakingly assembled upon for however many months that you had to go to kings and patrons in order to even get put on stage. Okay, fine, have a gap. After a while, people worked this very, very expertly into the art itself.
Sure.
Let's just break everything up and leave you on this gripping climax so that when we send people out there into
They're
the cold
talking,
weather,
they're just thinking about getting
they're
back
like, holy
to the
crap,
play.
what have we just seen?
Exactly. It's a cliffhanger. And it's a nice little cliffhanger when you couldn't have 24-episode TV series or part 2 movie series coming out in 3-4 years or something like that. It was a way just to get the guys back in the door, back passing whatever went for concession stands at the time, or just to get people excited about what's going to happen next. Maybe you'll have somebody ad-libbing a comedy piece in between everything, or doing a soliloquy from a famous play from a few years ago or something like that in between it, just for those people that don't even want to leave their seats. But still, you gotta stretch your legs. Some of these pieces are, 5 hours, 6 hours long. Remember seeing Lord of the Rings in the theater. 4 hours, too much. That's too much in the theater. I would have loved an intermission. Even the movies have intermissions. This is necessary.
That didn't have an intermission?
Lord of the Rings?
No.
Straight.
And that's funny because, but they used to considerably. I mean, considering I started off this premise with the opera, well, they continued that straight into modern Broadway, and that bled straight into the long form movies that were very prevalent around the 50s and 60s. They had, for instance, Ben-Hur. Ben-Hur is your classic example of the really long-form epic motion picture, and it has a very, very epic intermission with the main theme coming back just as it did in the overture. It served its purpose there, and it's fallen a little bit out of character, out of vogue today in modern film, but technically there's no reason to, because I still think that purpose is apt. We'll bring this back to music in a minute.
Well, I get that. I mean, even I do sound for burlesque and work with a few different burlesque shows, and they all do intermissions, but a lot of the time that's also for the performers to have a moment. I feel like
there's any number of reasons.
I feel like with music, especially in this case, in the 2 albums I cited, whereas MZ Chris smushes it together because there's no reason to break it up, because it's all one cohesive arc. This album, Extra Painful, there's no cohesive arc to that second disc, so why not break it up? I'm guessing is the logic. If it's all just extras and a mishmash behind the scenes almost, if you will, that's why they broke it up.
Of course. Well, in this particular case, it's more than obvious. This is, of course, not your classic example, simply because there is a purpose to each disc. The first disc is your reissue. That should be taken separately. The second disc is all the extra stuff. So, if that was smushed together in some kind of super long-form disc, you'd have a little bit of a continuity thing, where if you were not staring at your track list, as many people do, but also many people don't, just sit there and stare at the track list for the duration of listening to your album. You could be listening to the car. You could be in any form where you just listen to the flow of the record. Now, all of a sudden, you didn't realize that the last track on the actual album bled into your demo or your unreleased track. That's a continuity issue for them. They want you to change discs. That's a perfect way to force them to do it.
And there's also something that we're kind of glossing over, or maybe even forgetting. Vinyls, cassettes, they had to be run the opposite direction, or flipped over, or something like that.
Side 2, side B.
Yeah, no, I was getting to that.
B-sides, things like that. I mean, that
well
was
into it.
But that was actually because of the limitations of what you could put on side A.
Exactly.
That was not always purposeful. Some artists, and a lot of artists, even the Beatles did it. I think Sgt. Pepper's was ideally done to be a side A, side B, because of how dramatic the music gets between the two sides.
I know that from the beginning of vinyls, there were attempts to implement the same intermission
between
concept.
that flip.
Yeah, between just as like I said, they did in plays, but certain limitations also led to instances where people could not just do it as artistically, and you have many cases where, especially if you were trying to convey a symphony through vinyl, a lot of times it came off as very sloppy. Oddball places where you would never stop in the actual progression of your symphony. They'd try to cram it in with movements, but not all movements are the same length. So those are two mediums that completely clash. So I understand your point, John, is that there was the artistic origin of it, and then there was also the limitation origin of it. And sometimes they don't work out.
And I think the biggest problem nowadays is that people are still kind of adhering to the idea of having physical forms of media.
And having limitations, just as you did.
And not to say that it's a bad idea to have CDs, but, well, it's not the ideal way to store a lot of information in certain respects. Having a cloud system or having your purchase history on iTunes or individuals like that, using things like SoundCloud and what have
having
you.
the ability to hold your entire library in the palm of your hand.
Right,
Pretty
which I
freaking
do.
awesome.
Well, because the thing with my iPod is, like, people were always like, why don't you just get an iPhone? Because my iPod is 160 gigs, the iPhone is 8. I can carry my entire music library on my iPod.
And that inevitably will change.
Right.
At some point, there's going to be no need for
But for me,
already.
I think my hesitation, like, I like the iPod because it's still technically physical media, just compressed into a small physical thing. As opposed to the cloud, where it's this ethereal thing in the air, where if you send your stuff to it, but something happens to it, it's gone.
That's the big. Well, that's what we're getting to. But I just want to tie your 2 points together. Considering, John, you mentioned the fact that there is this need to go back to the limitation and think of the limitation in our heads, and as that was evident on vinyl, it kept being an issue. Almost like cyclically, it kept being an issue. On tapes, obviously, tape rolls end, and then on CDs, well, they came up with a way to cram about 770 meg initially on some of your earliest CDs, and that kind of remained the standard. They were able to push that a little bit further, but then they really didn't manage to ramp that up until DVDs, which are 4 gigs, and that never really took on as a form of music storage, simply because of the fact that albums were already deemed to be of a particular length.
And that's the problem.
We accepted it as that length of
that's
approximately
another
45 minutes to 90.
That's a physical limitation on an area that no longer needs that limitation.
That's a conceptual limitation.
A conceptual limitation.
Yeah. Right.
Caused from a physical reason. 45 minutes to an hour doesn't have to be the length of an album.
No, it doesn't. There have been many artists that, of course...
We've done a few reviews of really massive albums, of hitting 110, 120, 130.
And in the only case so far that we've actually had a true double disc album, not like, a split between remasters. Swan's To Be Kind back in episode 96. And the funny thing is at first I didn't recall it, but then when you think about it, there is a real build-up and conclusion to that first disc. Yeah. It actually ended with my favorite track, the very droning track of all the... We're talking about existential behavior today. Well, that track on the end of the first disc really exemplified it, and it was manic and disturbing all at the same time. It was an interesting way to leave you paused while you change discs, if you have to.
It occurs to me, though, I think why Spotify at least does this thing that irks me a bit. I had a conversation recently with one of my favorite nerdcore rappers, although I guess I should use that term very loosely because I love them all. I love all of you guys. But Tribe One, a Tribe One who's a very, very renowned rapper who's very good at what he does, has zero music on Spotify except for where he's been featured and his other band, Malibu Shark Attack, because they have a physical CD. That's the difference. The reason Tribe One is nowhere on Spotify and why a lot of Eli August stuff is not on Spotify, or even Painless Parker has nothing on Spotify, is you need a physical disc on selling from CD Baby or Amazon or somewhere, an actual physical disc that's in production
For Spotify to purchase.
for Spotify to put in their storage, in their system, and put you on their system.
Interesting.
That's-
So that's kind of ironic when you think about
That's
it.
not even
cloud.
That's stupid. That's a ridiculous idea.
Well, for starters, it's ironic, and if you want to believe it's stupid, it's stupid. But
That's
for a
ridiculous.
cloud company to have a bias against cloud artists,
Well, the reason is because they need a way to get the content. They need a way to have it, and they don't want to purchase it from another digital service. They want to have a physical version.
Do you know how many artists would just send them the files and be like, "Here, this is it's titled. It has all the pertinent
That's not what
information."
they want. They
Because every file that comes on a CD, every file that you
But the
get from iTunes, no. Don't interrupt me here. I'm on a tirade. Every file that you get from a cloud media has every little bit of what you want, unless you're legally downloading it, and then it's only about half the time. It says the year, it says track number, CD number, artist, composer.
Theoretically,
all these things are there.
theoretically, more still is possible. And well, you find this, of course, you find this in the case of any torrented file, even though that's kind of not what we're describing here. But
Yeah.
they'll try to give you even the PDF of the book jacket if they can get that in there. And PDFs theoretically could have so much more than you would even get on the book jacket. So it's infinite, the digital possibilities that are going with that file.
So for them to require a physical copy of a CD is just, it's archaic. It's asinine. They are actually still keeping what they want to do from reading full culmination.
All right, well, Matt is itching to retort.
The reason is, though, and good, bad, and different, is because it was probably the company was started by someone who owns CDs. That's probably the most basic answer. Is the reason they feel that that's the way it works is the people running Spotify, that's what they're used to. They're used to CDs, so that's what they want in order to create a library. It doesn't make it right, but that's possibly why.
Fair. Also, perhaps I would consider the, I guess the stigma that maybe internet marketing still has. Not that it really has a massive stigma, but I suppose in terms of just pitching yourself as more of a mature, having made it kind of artist, you're going to be sending out physical media.
And that's what I think the difference is also, is that
lots of bands, for instance, start up and end on Bandcamp, and that's as far as they will ever go, because they don't have, maybe it's because they were held back, maybe because they never got around to it, maybe they just don't have the chops to really make it and take that next step. A lot of times it has to do with will. Is this just something that you did as a hobby, that you're not really interested in doing as a profession, or are you the person willing to go all the way? Spotify and any major label wants people willing to go the extra mile.
But see, I have an artist that's an exception to that logic, and we know him. Painless Parker is a fantastic musician. The reason he doesn't have mass-produced CDs is because he doesn't. If you've seen Painless Parker, he doesn't scream mass market anything. His CDs are handmade. He stamps them himself. He creates the prints. He makes them himself. The handmade is part of his aesthetic. If he had printed plastic CDs, it wouldn't be the same, and that's why he doesn't.
He
do
walked
it.
himself into a special case in that.
I guess, but it's also he doesn't feel like you need printed physical media that's mass produced to connect with an audience, and that's fairly true. It's just he's
well, that's the other thing that the people see. Any major label is also going to be sort of wary of that kind of artist.
Right.
Because that kind of artist is going to... He's the bohemian. He's the quintessential bohemian. He is looking to give his art directly to the people who deserve it most. And that means that from the get-go, he has the propensity to bypass any record label. So, of course, they're going to be wary of that guy.
That makes sense.
Yeah, but Spotify is not that record label.
No, they're not. That's the funny thing
that.
is you'd think that would go around.
They're the opposite. They're like, here's music for free. If you want to pay us money, we'll give you more features. But here's music for free.
Yeah.
Because we're paying for it. Because we're putting it together, and we're not gonna
all this kind of amounts to the fact that I believe there's a snag that we don't know about in terms of that mandate.
They only have one computer to copy the songs onto.
Yeah, that's it.
That might be it.
That's it. It's a 98, Windows 98. That's the problem.
Yeah. Free cell.
They're slow. Yeah.
They still play free cell. There you go.
There you go.
Ultimately, though, I think it's just a matter of... We could go on a huge tangent about Spotify, and I feel like that's...
No, the whole thing, it sums up as this. Digital media is forever and further just becoming more and more oriented towards cloud in the public sector. Meanwhile, in the private sectors, when you start looking at governments and things like that, they're actually going further and further to the more physical ideas. They're getting away from the cloud. And these clashing ideas are causing some weird things to happen, like Spotify.
Well, when you mean private sector, specifically...
Businesses are looking more and more... Think about what just happened with Sony and their hacking thing that happened.
That was the point that I was getting to, because ultimately, if there's a major defense for removable media, it is just that. Is that removable media is not prone to the same kinds of hacking and sudden eradication that the cloud services ultimately are. You might think, okay, well, what is anyone gonna want to do with deleting my Beatles collection? What are they gonna gain from that? Okay, fine. Maybe that's not that big a deal. But let's say I'm listening to a sketchy new artist who is out there saying some things about the government that the government doesn't want heard. Theoretically, in your brave new world, the government can step in there and say this is unfit. Of course, this is romanticizing fiction here. Sensationalist kind of stuff, but it has been known to happen in the past, and we're entering territory, especially when you're dealing with like people like ISIS sitting over there. Theoretically, this is what could be a future of anyone who willingly lets this future happen. Then there's going to be that possibility where if there's any form of art that a government or an institution does not want out there, they can step in there and just simply delete it. And you won't have any choice over the matter because removable media, if at that point, will not be present.
There's also a further... You don't have to go with governments or someone with all-reaching powers. Just think about Sony is producing an artist. The artist breaks contract with Sony. Sony has the ability to go, and next time your device connects, delete your song because they're pissed off at the artist because of what they did. That's actually a lot more likely than the government even getting involved. Just the fact that they can revoke the licensing. They don't even have to delete it. If they can fool around with the licensing, it doesn't matter. You can't play it.
And then we go into that whole neighborhood of DRM and limited digital content. You can only download it to a certain amount of places so many times. There's
the best news that I've gotten in the last month is the fact that the U.S. government is trying to make the internet a service industry, such as plumbing or electrical, which means that all the internet organizations are not going to be able to put in the, quote, fast lanes, are not going to be able to physically limit our download speeds or our information connection or anything like that. Because the government is actually stepping in and standing up to everyone from AT&T to Time Warner Cable to all those groups.
There's a lot of people...
That is amazing and great and is a step in the right direction.
Obviously, this has been going on for several years now, and there's lots of people who stepped in there to take that stance. And it needs to be done now because we're still kind of in the beginning, the new era of these issues.
It's still infantile in its legacy. Yeah, for sure.
We just reviewed an album that didn't know these issues existed as of its time.
That is true.
93, you're not dealing with a very widespread internet.
So, moving forward from our topic to wrapping up today's episode, I made a joke last week that we wouldn't have to do spam ever again if we got a fan mail every week. Well, we conveniently got another fan mail this week. And Steve is going to read that for us. It's actually a return message from Knockjaw, our friend Jose, who had reached out to us about Daryl.
That's right. He recommended Daryl was a review back on episode 114.
And he reached out to us with such.
All right. Dear Crash Chords Podcast, right off the bat, I want to give my excessively overdue thanks to you guys for taking up my suggestion of reviewing Ohio by Daryl. I learned a few new things about the composure of that album's tracks through your musical diagnosis, as well as learning how to better understand and appreciate music itself, and I am very grateful for that knowledge. So sweet. Speaking of which, I recall John requests that someone send him the lyrics to the album mentioned in said episode. He keeps the timestamp. Awesome. 2 hours, 14 minutes, 38 seconds, if anyone had them.
And thank you very, very much.
In the case that no one's done that yet, I've attached them to this email, but I'm afraid that they might be hard to understand, not because of the image quality, but because of the way the words are presented on print. I am not exaggerating when I say that the lyrics seem to be a huge run-on sentence. A shame, really. On a side note, I have been completely enamored with a band I recently discovered while listening to some of your archived episodes, and that band was Arctic Monkeys. I haven't been as transfixed by the sound of a band since a friend of mine introduced me to the Gorillaz and Cage the Elephant. I honestly think all their albums are worth being reviewed, but I know that that request is far too selfish of me to be fulfilled. That being said, if there was one album that I could ask you to review, it would be their third album, Humbug. I find that that's their most musically and lyrically quizzical album, in my opinion. That's intriguing. I never heard of an album being described as lyrically quizzical. Lastly, I want to wish you gentlemen a most prosperous new year, and judging from your new writer, Tony's new article on the band Mostly Other People Do the Killing's Blue album, I very much look forward to the content to be produced in the coming months. Cheers, Jose.
So, Knockjaw, we're going to be best friends, because you just named 3 of my favorite bands out of this moment.
Duh.
Come on. Cage the Elephant, Gorillaz, and
Arctic Monkeys.
Come on. We reviewed 2 of them and talked about Gorillaz all the freaking time.
Well, he said he was looking through the archived episodes.
And we did review David
Then again,
Albarn's
we've also reviewed bands we didn't like.
Even though I don't think we ever really did.
Interesting that he mentioned Arctic Monkeys also, because I was just driving in the car with my friend the other day, and he had on playing that album, AM, which we reviewed back in episode 66, by the way. And I remember being very intrigued by it at the time. I wasn't blown away by it, but I remember being very intrigued as of the time we reviewed it. And then it seemed to get more stuck in my head on this particular listen around. So who knows? We might see even a year belated rating rising going on in the 2015 year in review.
It could be, yeah. And with the theme of fan work, I do want to talk about our fan who we read an email from last week, Mr. Mark H. He had put in a fan request for us, and it's about time we do our January fan request, and I'd like to use his suggestion. I'm going to put off my album of choice till next month, and we're going to do his suggestion of D'Angelo's new record, Black Messiah, which did come out at the tail end of 2014, and I'm actually really excited to review this album because it's gotten a lot of really positive review, and there's been a lot of hype about it. So
did this album. So did Extra Painful and Painful. So
we're moving past that.
Okay.
Wow.
So
out with the old, in with the new.
So, Mark, I want to thank you for your suggestion. We are going to take that on next week, so tune in for that. Steve will, of course, reach out to you via email to let you know when it's gone up, just in case you're not following us on iTunes yet, though you should be. Sure. But thank you for that suggestion. I'm actually excited to hear it. And I guess this is a great place to say, as we do every week, music is life,
and life is good.
If you enjoyed this and other album analyses, topics, and guests, please subscribe to the Crash Chords podcast on iTunes, where you can also rate us and review us. For more media, also subscribe to Matt's one-on-one interview series, Crash Chords Autographs. To receive emails on all new content, subscribe at the top of our homepage. Also receive updates by liking us on Facebook, following us on Twitter at Crash Chords Web, our Tumblr, and our YouTube channel. And remember, keep the discussion going, because music is life, and life is good. If you have any questions or comments, feel free to share them in the comment board below each post. Otherwise, email us directly at admin@crashchords.com.